Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the We Aspire webinar session. My name is Samson Tefera. I am the president and co-founder of We Aspire. We Aspire's mission is to enhance the world knowledge about Africa and its people, run by a group of volunteers who understand the value of intellectual approach to the information sharing. The group believes that by modeling together knowledge, passion, humility, and kindness, and various verticals and disciplines can be discussed and debate in order to present and share the best work to address these topics that are crucial to Africa. So we want poverty to be a thing of the past. We want to empower by presenting context. We want to step in where there is a void. We want to reach out when there is a need. We want to support when a project is burdened. We want to protect when the witness are vulnerable and cause. We exist because we care. We are Africans standing for Africa, as I said earlier to you in the introduction. We are trying to promote dialogue among Africans and friends of Africa. Welcome to the session. Thank you very much. And unless Dr. Trusso have any opening remark, I'm going to start going to by the first panelist, Dr. Trusso.
And we really appreciate all the contribution behind the scene we get through others. Keep sending your questions, and we have also other streaming through YouTube and other areas as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trusso. Our first speaker is Dr. Paul Block, as an associate professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Paul Block is an expert specializing in hydroclimatology and water resource management. His research teams are centered on a system-based approach, bridging a model and a method across climate science, hydrology, management, the environment, economics, and policy. Specific area of expertise include climate risk management, affects climate variability and change on water system, hydrologic forecasting and uncertainty, and policies and mechanisms designed to increase reliability and reduce vulnerability. Dr. Paul has worked on Nile Basin related projects since 2003, including seasonal perception and stream forecasting, hydropower and irrigation trade-offs, agriculture economic modeling, and climate change impacts on the energy sector. We will provide a link at the end of this panel if you want to know more about his projects. With that, Dr. Paul, I will hand the mic to you.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm excited to be here, so thank you for that. And to the audience, I look forward to your questions. What I would like to spend the next few minutes on today, for my part, is really to focus on some of the more perhaps technical or methodological pieces that we have done. I know some of the other panelists today have expertise in other areas, so I thought this would maybe complement theirs a little bit more. This is just a snapshot of some of the work that we have been doing. And for those of you that have seen some of my other presentations recently, some of this will look familiar. So I really want to focus on this idea from beginning to end of the fact that we have natural hydrologic variability. Of course, not just in the Nile Basin, but in most basins and in most places around the world, where we have either dominant rainy seasons, dry seasons, etc. We have natural hydrologic variability. And when we as a society are taking advantage of rivers or streams or lakes, we need to be cognizant of this hydrologic variability. So what this means is some years may be wetter, some years may be drier. In the context of the inflows to the GERD, this plot generally shows over the past 50 plus years what is experienced. And so as we are very familiar, November through June or so, flows into the reservoir are quite low. And it's really during this dominant rainy season, July through October, that most inflow comes into the GERD. So when we talk about natural hydrologic variability, it's really during this season that we're focused. And so you can see that some years it's considerably lower and some years considerably higher. So having understanding of that, perhaps an anticipation of that, may be useful and advantageous in planning, both for operations of the GERD, but certainly downstream as well for lives and livelihoods. If we do look at some of those downstream records, here is a time series of inflows at the High Aswan Dam. Of course, we can see that there are periods of average conditions and high flows and low flows as well. So this is complicating, but this is natural hydrologic variability. So when one is thinking, or when parties are thinking about water sharing policies, upstream, downstream negotiations and operations, et cetera, we have to take into account these low and these high periods as part of that planning process. I imagine most of you are very familiar with this, but just to recap, last summer in 2020, there was about almost 5 billion cubic meters of storage behind the GERD that was impounded. And the plan is, as far as I'm still aware, is to add another 13.5 this summer. And then starting in the following years, over maybe 4 to 7 years, which I believe there's still some room for a negotiation on that. The remainder, 50 plus billion cubic meters to get it to the full 74 billion cubic meters. So obviously the flow that is not impounded is released downstream to Sudan. This has lots of implications. I am actually not going to focus so much on this filling period today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the long-term operations, but it is really, really important to think about this filling period because this is what's happening now. Without going into too many details, the climate models, well, I'll say, so knowing whether it's a dry or wet year could be really, really informative. Again, both for upstream and for downstream. So we've been looking at this, and others obviously look at this as well. Without going into too many details, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, does tend to affect the climate in this region. And it seems as if the conditions are projected to favor neutral or La Nina-like conditions, which typically means a little bit wetter than average conditions. I can't say that this will be the case, of course, but it could be such that impounding, if it is a high flow season, impounding some of the water that 13.5 behind GERD, depending on the timing, could be advantageous so that we don't have another scenario like last year in the greater Khartoum area where there was extensive and deadly flooding. So just one other picture on what the models are saying. This is a precipitation model prediction. And if you look in the upper Blue Nile portion in Ethiopia, you can see that it's mostly some greens and some blue colors. And that means there's a projection of slightly wetter than average conditions for this coming rainy season. But what I really want to focus on today is a little bit more on the long-term operations. I'm happy to answer some questions related to filling policy. But these are two questions that I want to focus on my remarks. How could these water sharing strategies work once the reservoir behind the GERD is filled? And how do we account for this natural hydrologic variability? It's not a static system, so we should not have to think that the system should be operated in a static way. So if the GERD is not existing now, if it's not there, this is essentially how the system works at the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. And essentially, it's as simple as whatever comes in 1 year is what's passed downstream. There's no change to that in time in any way. So if it's a wet year, as is an example here, then all that water's passed. If it's a very dry year, then it's a dry year downstream. So there's no alteration of that. And this becomes important because part of the conversation, of course, is if or how the Renaissance Dam should perform during dry or drought type conditions. So many of you are also familiar with this Washington policy. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on this policy. The main ideas behind it was that the GERD could act during drought or dry conditions as a supplementary source for downstream. So the conditions that was based on were what was coming in that year and how much water was in the reservoir. So if it's a dry year, but Ethiopia had managed their reservoir in such a way that the reservoir was full, they would be then required to pass a significant amount of water downstream. If it were a dry year, but Ethiopia had managed their reservoir such that it was low now, they wouldn't have to pass as much downstream. So there are some problematic aspects here, I would contend, because it starts mixing with the operations of the Renaissance Dam. Of course, if there were one water resources manager operating the entire system, that might be a viable way to do it. But we have jurisdictions, of course, and we need to think about what this means. So I'm going to simplify this down and really focus on two aspects. I'm going to focus on upstream hydropower and the trade-offs or the balance with downstream flows. There's too much to look at here. This is, I guess, to show you that we've actually done some modeling and some work. But the important thing is that we want these policies to focus on these two aspects here, or keep these as priorities. One is a policy that shares the hydrologic variability. So I would contend that with this Washington policy and policies similar to that, the hydrologic variability is not really fully being shared by upstream and downstream countries. And what I mean by that is when it's a wetter than average year, all countries should share in that. When it's a drier than average year, all countries should share in that as well. The second thing is we want to have a policy that gives Ethiopia sovereignty over its operations. This in no means implies that they would operate it in a way that would be detrimental to downstream. And the way they operate it needs to be fully transparent to downstream and their policies and plans. But my argument would be that it doesn't need to act necessarily and primarily as a supplement to downstream. And what you'll see is the policy that we've developed here actually works on both of those fronts. So there are outcomes that are positive for both. So this just is a quick summary of the pieces that will go into this. So back to this slide again. Thinking about these two trade-offs, one of the policies, and we'll dig into this a little bit, would end up looking like this. And so we're looking at a minimum hydropower generation level per month or per year, you can say, and looking at downstream flows. And it's an optimization model, so we end up optimizing to this hydropower level. And so what happens here naturally, which is actually advantageous, is over on the right-hand side of the figure. These are the years that are wetter. And you can see when it's wet, not all of that water is passed downstream. Some of it is impounded as we would expect. However, in the dry years, much as would be desired by downstream countries, more water is actually passed. So in a year where, say, 40 billion cubic meters comes in, depending on how we fashion this policy, which I'll show you in a minute, there could be more than 45 being passed downstream. And the reason for this is it's advantageous for Ethiopia also because they want to be generating hydropower, and surely they will have domestic responsibilities and international contracts, et cetera, that they need to be supplying. So what one can do then with these these are different years, is start to draw on these different water sharing policies. And it really depends on your risk aversion or your level of comfort with these. And so then the way that these work is in the negotiations, one of these would be selected, one of these colorful lines. And this would be the policy then that one would follow. So all you would need to know is what comes in. So depending on how much flows in, that's how much then can be read off for the flow downstream. So the idea is it becomes simple and transparent to everyone, but still allows much more flexibility for Ethiopia in their operations, and I will argue better shares the hydrologic variability. So you can do this for a variety of different output levels, different hydropower generation levels. And for maximizing your hydropower on the left would be similar to that. You can see that there's not much, does not end up being much supplement downstream because there has to be more water retained upstream. Whereas if you reduce that somewhat, you can see that becomes a little more balance, or the gradient of that line becomes less. A couple other features that are worth pointing out. Sorry for all of the technical figures here. But these two distributions, the green one shows what naturally flows in, and then the peach color represents what comes out under this type of a policy. And you can see that there are some important features here. And one of the really important features is the reduction in the tail on the left. So the reduction in the dry tail. So, and you can see that by the supplementing in the figure on the right there. So the two values given there, the 35.8 and the 41.2, those are the 10th percentile values. So we would consider those, drought or dry conditions. So really moving that up such that downstream countries are arguably better off during those conditions than without the GERD being online. So in the end, it becomes a trade-off. And I didn't put any numbers on here. We have numbers, of course, but just to very much simplify, it's a trade-off between power generation and downstream flow or downstream drought. And you can see that probably most clearly here, the same idea. We talk about this 10th percentile representing drought type conditions. And under this type of policy, we're really able to shift it somewhat, and under dry conditions, it becomes really important so that hydropower is preserved in Ethiopia, and downstream flows are able to be better realized, or realized in a higher manner, we would say, under these flexible type policy versus a static policy, which would require the same amount or something that's much more fixed, like the Washington policy. So I'm going to end with this question. So this analysis that we have done, of course, looks at one alternative for a water sharing policy between upstream and downstream, really focused on the GERD operations. Of course, we know that's not the end of the story, and it's certainly not the end of the conversation, as I understand it, that's happening now, because it doesn't necessarily account for future upstream development. So this is a really important question, and I'm going to leave that one open and see if any of the other panelists address that. And if not, I'm happy to circle back to that later in the conversation. So I don't know how well I did for timing, but I will stop there, Samson, and pass it over to another panelist. So thank you very much.
You did great, Paul. Thank you so much. And I encourage the attendees to start posting your questions. And at the end of the three presentations, Dr. Turusa will summarize the panel members' presentation. I'm going to go to our next speaker, Mr. Frederick Mugira from Kampala. Welcome. Frederick Mugira is an award-winning water and climate change journalist. He's involved in geojournalism platform that maps data on water issues in the Nile River Basin and overlays them with journalism stories to promote transboundary peace. Frederick works as an editor with Uganda leading multimedia house Vision Group, a national geographic storytelling explorer, and a Pulsar Center grantee. Frederick has reported from various countries in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the United States. Among his accolades are a prestigious CNN Multi-Choice African Journalism Award and the UN Development Journalism Award. He's an master's in development communication. He also studied environmental journalism. With that, I'll hand the mic to Mr. Frederick. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As you say, my name is Frederick Mugira. I founded Water Journalists Africa. Water Journalists Africa is a network of about 700 journalists in Africa. We started this network in 2011, and we operate in 50 countries in the continent. I also co-founded Infonile. Infonile is a geojournalism platform, as you said. we are about 400 journalists operating in the 11 countries in the Nile Basin. Yeah, so my topic, I want to look at stereotypes and what the media can do to tell honest stories about the Nile. This is pure journalism stuff, not science like Paul gave us that stuff. So you would wonder, for the last 15 years, I've been reporting about the story of the Nile, the story of climate change, the story of water in the Nile Basin, and I've seen these things. I have seen, for example, the story of climate change start and grow, and this kind of growing and, kind of by making people bored, boring people, but, you get some new angles and you have it interesting. So you wonder, there are so many stereotypes in the media that you look at, written by the journalists themselves, and also other people, I mean, everyone is free to publish. So, for example, if some media, you find that, they describe Nile Basin as 10 countries, not 11. So sometimes literature is not counted. In the media also, you find the pics, it shows the dam construction and most especially regard as the big issue, and forgetting that there are so many big issues in the Nile Basin: climate change, excessive water extraction, pollution. These are so good stories that should be told, but now concentration is on the dam construction. I know the effects, what this means to Egypt, what this means to other countries, to Ethiopia, and now we are forgetting as journalists and even other storytellers the stories of climate change, how local people are suffering, and then we are concentrating only on the dam construction. Then also length versus volume, and the volume or average discharge of water. You find, in the media, journalists writing that almost showing that the length of the river Nile is almost means that it has kind of a lot of water. And if you some research, some books indicate that River Nile, the volume of water, the average discharge of River Nile puts it at number 95 in the whole world. So not so much water in it, although it is long, the longest river, probably the second longest, depending on what you think, when you compare it with the Amazon. And then also it looks like River Nile is Egypt. Yeah, so when you read about the stories, it's just Egypt. But well, also Ethiopia, but sometimes this Egypt is Egypt, and you think that River Nile is Egypt, and sometimes Ethiopia. And we forget these other states like Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, DR Congo, for example. You don't hear about the Democratic Republic of Congo. These other countries are also there, and also. Most of the stories now, if you read through, you think that scarcity is a result of water. Scarcity results into conflict and oppression, and not giving explanation that the water scarcity does not result into conflict and oppression. Conflict and oppression is a result of political choices and decisions taken by governments, by the diplomats, but not just water scarcity. Yeah. So I just want to give you a few points of what how the media can tell more honesty stories about the Nile. And these are stories, these are points I just picked, and I think probably they are cross-cutting and not just for one country in the Nile Basin, but different countries. So when you look at stories and you take keen interest, or maybe if you did the content analysis of the stories in the media, in the Nile Basin, the 11 countries that have they write the story of the Nile, and you find a lot of speculative stories. You find politicians speaking, diplomats speaking. They're just speculations, and you don't find evidence. But if you want to tell a honest story, you would go ahead and look for the evidence. The evidence, probably from researchers, use data, multi-sourced, meaning they're talking to different sources, local people, diplomats, researchers, and then you let the readers take their own judgment, not you as journalists to decide for them. They read and then they come to a conclusion, not just because you want to write speculative stories and then you talk to one or two politicians and then proper use of words, like cooperation, collaboration, and coordination. These mean different things, but you find in them sometimes they are used wrongly in the media. We did a baseline study of the media in the Nile Basin about 2 years ago, and we found a lot of these things. We found a lot of things like I will be showing you, data, the way they describe, people, the sources. They just source stories from politicians. You go to a function and you cover one politician speaking, and you just write a story, not knowing that even that politician, that is his kind of thinking, but it may be wrong. It's not supported with facts. So, and also we have to question official statements and social media accounts of local governments and in the region, governments and stuff like that, and people advocating for different positions come up and send out press statements. They have social media accounts like Twitter, and then if you look at it, you think it's genuine. So you get a story and you publish it, not knowing that this person is trying to flaunt his position, and it may be wrong, not supported with facts. It's just something that this guy feels he should want to put up. And also, we have found out, and as we were doing our study and working with the different sources in the Nile Basin, we found out that some scientists are just planted by governments. A scientist is right there, giving facts. They look like facts, but they tend to kind of support the position of the government that is been working for, or things of that nature. So when we are working on a story about River Nile, it's important to talk to credible and impartial sources, such as the Nile Basin Initiative. There's so many stories about River Nile, and you never find the Nile Basin Initiative quoted. These are guys who have done studies, they have data, they have everything, they have scientists, and everything you would want. But there are other witnesses. Probably you may contact them and they take long to answer your calls. I'm not sure about that, but these are people that are credible. This is a credible source, impartial, and when you quote it in the media, everyone would feel it's the right position. So also, bad news versus solutions-based stories. Is it enough, for example, to have bad news? Why don't we focus on, solutions-based stories? What's happening, so that other countries, other communities can learn from these solutions-based stories and kind of, implement them in their communities. You realize that the more you write about bad news and bad stories, the more you kind of, breed a generation that likes what is bad and hates what is good. So so they would want bad stories, because that's what the media has given them. So, but this time we think that we should focus on solutions-based stories. Probably then they would kind of help communities find solutions to these problems. Also, event-based stories versus enterprise and real-life stories. The event-based stories are these stories I was telling you at the beginning. A journalist goes to the field, finds a politician speaking, and then records and then writes a story. Full stop. Not talking to local people affected, not talking to scientists to interpret. Not the the politicians may want to just say anything because they want to win votes, and that stuff that they say may be wrong. So it's very important for us to kind of do enterprise stories, real life stories. These are things that I have found out as I worked with the media in the Nile Basin for the last 15 years. Also, you realize that most of these stories are national based and not transboundary stories. We are talking about a river that goes through so many countries. It's a cross-border river. But you find these stories, the journalists are preferring to write stories, national stories, and not, they don't want to collaborate, work with different journalists in the region to tell the bigger story of the Nile, not just the story of the country or their countries. Then benefits versus competing for the water resources. It's important to talk about the benefits. It takes me back to the point of solutions. What is it that we get from the river? Instead of of writing stories about competing, Ethiopia and Egypt competing for the water, what about that story of what we are going to benefit from the river? Yeah. So then you would wonder, after telling you all this, and this is my modest view of things. So you would wonder, journalists held in the brainstorm, for example, how much can journalists control when they're writing these stories? Journalists that live, work in countries where they face no or little media freedom, what can they do? If they have, governments control them, what can they do? How much can these journalists control? Are they able, for example, to write balanced stories, have all positions in the story? What will their governments say? So then, are these journalists now living the fear of reporting the truth? You see, you are in the newsroom, you have this story, what I'm going to write about is probably 60%, right? Because I want to appease my government, but I think what I'm going to write now is not right. Journalists in different countries in the Nile Basin face these challenges. These are things that we have to think about. Sometimes we hold them in the brainstorm and, I would say journalists, they are not doing this, they are not doing that, but also they have several factors that affect the way they write their stories. Also, is every storyteller a journalist? Find these stories are everywhere on the media, on internet, in the media. Someone wakes up and writes a story. Probably he wants to, write a good story because of what he, feels he wants to promote or to advocate for. But when we read about it, what comes into your mind is it that this journalist, this is a journalist writing a story or someone? These are things we have to think about as we read these stories. Also, writing good stories versus consequences and harm. Is it enough, for example, to know how to write a good story? Or if that journalist has to go an extra mile and know the consequences of this story is going to write? What is he aiming at? Yeah, you find journalists who know how to write very good stories and are good storytellers, but what is the consequence of the story? These are things that we, as storytellers, have to think about. And also, think about scientists' trust and journalists. That trust gap between scientists and journalists, what does it lead to? If, for example, the journalists are not able to go to the scientists and get all of these facts, researches that have been done, and then bring them out, if scientists and researchers prefer to keep their research in the bookshelves, what do you expect these journalists to write about? Because they will lack right information. They will lack facts, data that they would have used in their story. So it's very important to narrow that trust gap. I know scientists would say that journalists are misrepresenting our information, so we prefer to keep it from them. But again, what's the bigger picture? So then they are left, they write stories which are not true, which are not factual, and then you find misleading people. Also, after telling you all this, so has the media failed its duty? Yeah, I mean, there are so many that the media hasn't done. When you see clashes, when you see what's happening in the Nile Basin, if we don't see these stories, climate change, things of that nature, has the media failed its role? These are things that we need to think about and then find answers for. Yeah, so as I told you, I work with Info. I just wanted to show you how we do this. And in these 2 slides, I'll be answering those questions that I posed. So at InfoNile, we bring together journalists and media houses to investigate common topics on environmental and scientific topics in a collaborative way. Now here, in a collaborative way, these are keywords. So I'm trying to show you that we want to bring journalists from the region to work together. So we kill we keep the what makes them work as individuals, but rather want them to work with different journalists in the region. So we identify a theme of common and cross-border importance. Like in the past, we have worked on water scarcity during COVID-19. We have worked on a project about climate change. We have worked on a project about wildlife trafficking and conservation. We are currently completing a project on biodiversity in transboundary lakes, and also looking at foreign land deals. This is a project of that. So what we do, we source credible data that is cross-cutting, cross-country. And as we practice this, this is real geojournalism. So we source data from scientists, and then in the past we have sourced data on water access, rainfall and rain and runoff, land acquisition. This is the data from different journalists, from scientists. And as we do this, then we are trying to narrow down the trust gap, to make sure that we co-produce knowledge. Journalists and researchers co-produce knowledge. They work together and then co-produce knowledge. So when we call for pitches from local journalists in the 11 countries to report on in-depth stories, and then we provide funds for field reporting. We have provided about funds to about 200 journalists to do 200 stories. So we have now 200 stories and 200 journalists. We maintain training these journalists in data journalism, environmental and science reporting, and we have trained about 150 journalists. This is in the last 4 years. And then local journalists publish the stories in their local media houses, and often in local languages, so that they have that kind of feel of the local picture. So we have published over 200 stories in the last four years. And then also at InfoNile, we translate these stories into different languages: Amharic, Arabic, Swahili, French. We have different coordinators. We have 5 coordinators in different countries: in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and Rwanda. So then later we bring these stories and do cross-border multimedia projects. I've done about 5 big projects that we publish, with the interactive maps, drone videos, photography, satellite imagery, and graphics. So as we do this again, we work with scientists. We want to fill that gap, the trust gap. As we do this, then we want to bring together journalists from different countries to tell the story. If, for example, some of the journalists prefer to have their stories published by other media houses in different countries because they feel that such kind of stories will not be welcome in their countries, so they give them to us, and then we have them published in different countries. Then also we create actionable interactive maps, which we publish with stories. We have done over 10 maps. Yeah. So then that's how I end my presentation. I will welcome questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frederick. The theme of your presentation, how can the media tell more honest stories about the Nile? And I qualify that. How can the media tell more honest stories about Africa? I think that's what we're really facing a challenge today. As you said, there are more speculative stories from the diplomats and from the politicians, versus evidence-based storytelling. And I'm highly encouraged. We do have a journalist that works with We Aspire. We look forward working with you. If you visit our website, weaspire.info, you'll find those evidence-based stories. And thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to go to our next speaker, Dr. Khalid Siddiq. I apologize if I mispronounce names. You'll correct me when you start speaking. He's a senior researcher at the International Agriculture Trade and Development Group of the Humboldt University of Berlin, Germany, and an associate professor of agriculture economics at the University of Khartoum, the Sudan. He obtained habilitation, a PhD, and a MSc degree in agriculture economics, respective, at the University of Hohenheim, Germany, University of Gießen, Germany, and University of Khartoum, Sudan. His research examined the trade-off and synergies amongst the production and use of water, energy, and food in developing countries under the dynamics of climate, population, and policies, including the distribution and economy-wide regional implication. He's currently offering courses on economics of agriculture and rural development, economic simulation modeling in agriculture and food economic. Mr. Siddiq is a 2016 to 2019 GTAP Research Fellow, Purdue University. With that, I will welcome our brother, Khalid, and pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samson. And thank you, Terezu. And I also thank We Aspire for the invitation. I'm glad to be here and glad to be with Paul and Frederick in this interesting session. I chose the title, Potential Economy-Wide Benefits to Sudan from GERD-Induced Irrigation Extension and Electricity Generation for this presentation, looking for a brighter side of the story, maybe something that we celebrate today. So, and I would like to maybe open this by saying that the credit goes to an article that I wrote together with Mohammed Bashir and Yunus Lokman, and the article has been published with Water International recently. And just to warm up everyone here, maybe a couple of questions. Does GERD bring opportunities only? I think the obvious answer is no. The second question, does GERD bring risks only? The obvious question is also no. Are the opportunities higher than risks? It depends. And hopefully yes, and that needs some work. How are risks and opportunities distributed, especially, and here we mean the different beneficiaries, or at least the countries in the upstream and the downstream. And that is also a question that needs to be answered. But that is not necessarily the focus of the presentation today. What I would do is that I would follow some sort of conventional presentation. I did not prepare a fancy presentation with a lot of figures like Paul or nice photos like Frederick. So mine would be somehow of a conventional presentation where I would start by a brief introduction. I talk about our approach and then the simulations that we implemented and our approach and some results, so that we would see some results today and a little bit of conclusions and some caveats at the end. So let us start by an introduction in which I would like to say that agriculture is important in Sudan, and irrigated agriculture is also very important, despite the fact that the land under cultivation in irrigated agriculture is much smaller than the rain-fed agriculture. But the contribution that irrigated agriculture make to the country's output and GDP is very big. And here, the irrigated agriculture depend entirely on the Nile stream flow. Hydropower is also getting important in Sudan, contributing roughly 60% of the total electricity generated in Sudan. GERD can potentially help in different aspects. One of them is that it can regulate the flow of the Blue Nile, and that could consequently improve the generation of hydropower in Sudan. And it could also help, additional extending irrigated agriculture beyond the currently cultivated land. This, however, is not possible under all conditions. There could be some issues with GERD, including environmental impact and losses in various parts of the agricultural sector, particularly the recession agriculture that many households in the country depends on. Despite the many years of negotiation, as maybe in this platform, I would assume several panels has discussed the negotiation process, in which I am not expert. But until now, the countries, particularly Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, are not able to reach an agreement. And because GERD is significantly important for Ethiopia and could also lead to substantial changes in the inter and intra-annual variability of the Blue Nile flow and then the entire Nile flow, we believe that looking at some opportunities for the Sudan from the GERD is something that one need to do, and that is exactly what we're doing here. Now, when we zoom into Sudan particularly, let us highlight some of the potential benefits. This includes, of course, the flood control. And some studies suggest that the probability of flood alert at Khartoum would decline from 6 to 2%. It would allow increasing the irrigated land, irrigated agriculture beyond what is currently being irrigated, assuming that there would be no water shortages for irrigation. GERD could also increase hydropower generation. Some studies suggest that overall increase in hydropower generation in Sudan after GERD could be 20%. GERD might induce some possibilities of additional river navigation because of the level of the water. And it would also allow Sudan importing electricity from Ethiopia, assuming that there would be some sort of possibilities, economic and political. Now, this is the brighter side of the story when it comes to GERD and Sudan. However, this is not always bright and nice. There are also potential risks. And one of these risks is what I mentioned earlier, the recession agriculture. Someone who grew up in a village, which is an island in the Nile, in the north of Sudan, I know how important is recession agriculture. So that would be lost. The safety issue, which is very critical. I'm not expert in this. Maybe Baul can say a few words maybe later afterwards. But the dam is very close to the borders of Sudan. And if safety issues would be happening, then that would be a catastrophe for Sudan. There would be the loss of sediment, and that could implicate on natural land fertility in different places in the country, could induce morphological changes and loss in the possibility of producing red brick in Sudan. We have another study which we are working on right now to look at the impact of GERD, potential impact of GERD on this industry. And finally, one of the issues is the environmental impact, which is not very clear right now, and that could be a big issue. Now, looking at these, benefits and risks, what I would like to highlight is that we're not looking at all these things. We're not considering all these things in the study that I would be presenting here. We are focusing only on two of the potential benefits. And these particularly are irrigation extension and hydropower generation extension. The rest is not included here, and this needs to be very clear right from now. Now, let me say a few words about our approach, the approach that we follow in order to look at this, economy-wide implications of these simulations. We actually use an economy-wide model, which is called the computable general equilibrium model, and we feed the parameters for the long-term impact on irrigation extension and hydropower generation extension from different biophysical models that are highlighted in this figure. Maybe later, if there would be technical question on them, I would be very happy to come back to them. Maybe now I'll just keep it short. This was based on a study that is highlighted here. And the data for Sudan is for the post-separation period, so without South Sudan, which makes it different than the other studies that try to do the same before. Now, the bland irrigation scheme. So when we talk about potential irrigation extension in Sudan, that cannot be just simply said like this. That was based on a study by Bashir and others, in which they looked at documents provided by Kinana Sugar Company in that area of Sudan, in the central part of Sudan, where there were a couple of irrigation projects planned already since several years. And these are 9 different projects. 4 of them are at the left bank of the Blue Nile, and the other 5 are at the right-hand side of the Blue Nile. The total area of them would be very close to 1 million hectare. And so this is the area that is considered to be, the buffer for extending the currently cultivated land within the irrigated sector in Sudan. This area was suggested to be grown by 7 different crops, and these crops are suitable to be grown in that area of the Blue Nile. Now, let us look at the simulation scenarios. So how did we set up this area extension and hydropower generation extension in our model? We looked based on previous studies on the collaboration between Ethiopia and Sudan, particularly at 3 possibilities of collaboration. One of them is unilateral action, in which Ethiopia would independently operate the GERD and maximize the generation of electricity in Ethiopia without considering the Sudan and Egypt. The second scenario, or the second cooperation setup, is coordination, in which Ethiopia, while maximizing the generation of electricity, they would share information with Sudan, especially with regard to the outflow and the amount of water would be released beforehand, so that the administration in Sudan would be prepared when it comes to the administration of the domestic dams for electricity generation and for agricultural practices. The third collaboration or cooperation setting is called collaboration, in which Ethiopia would not only share information, but also consider the minimum, or at least the reasonable requirement of the irrigated agriculture and electricity generation in Sudan. And that is all about the cooperation between the 2 countries. These cooperation scenarios are combined by cropping patterns. So we set up the level of cooperation, then what happened? So under each level of cooperation, what would happen in terms of the generation of electricity and the cultivation of additional crops. So the 7 crops that were selected earlier will be cultivated under 3 different cropping patterns. I would show the cropping pattern soon. But on the top of that, electricity generation in Sudan would increase by 20%, according to studies. So that is also implemented in our setting. The cropping patterns are 4, so 7 crops. The first cropping pattern assumed that the 7 crops would be grown, equally. The land would be distributed equally over them. The second cropping pattern 2, would give more, would basically distribute the land based on their gross margin, so that the annual gross margins of these crops, and therefore you see that the cash crops are getting most of the land, particularly sugarcane, cotton, and sesame. The third cropping pattern prioritize these cash crops, giving each one of them 20% of the land, and putting the rest of the land equally on the other crops, 10% each. So now we have these cropping patterns together with the cooperation states. We have some assumptions. I would highlight some of them now while setting up the simulations. The irrigated agriculture expansion in Sudan is not going to happen during the filling period, and the hydropower generation too. All that will be implemented after the filling period, and the filling period implemented here is 5 years. So the implementation of this extension would happen from 2025. As we know, the filling started already last year. And the extension of projects, because we have 1 million hectare, it cannot be implemented directly. Our assumption is that we implement it pretty rapidly, 1 project every 3 years. And that is considerably rapid, but that is the assumption we adopted here. So we have 3 cooperation states. Each one is implemented with the 3 cropping patterns. And that is how then our results would be related to. I will start by looking at the crop sector, and that is the aggregate crop sector in Sudan. So all the crops aggregated together. And you have to know that some of these crops would benefit from GERD and some would not benefit from GERD, but they would be harmed by GERD because the newly cultivated land due to GERD would withdraw some production factors from them. And so, but the aggregate impact, looking at the figure here on the top left-hand side, this is in US dollar billions, and we're talking about the 40 years from 2020 to 2060 aggregate. So this is accumulate numbers. I would probably not very much focus on the numbers itself, but maybe let's look at the comparison. So you see that under each cooperation state, you would see 1 scenario that is showing a higher number, and that is cropping pattern number 2. So you see, obviously, the cropping pattern is more influential in this context, and these here are the same results but presented in terms of percentage point differences. Below here, I just reversed the setting of the figure. So this is the same figure basically, but we put the cropping patterns at the bottom. And you see that cropping pattern number 2 is actually the highlight of the results. Here I'm looking at the industry and the service sectors. So industry is the blue, and the service is the light blue or light green. I'm not good in colors. And you see that, so good news is that all the sectors in aggregate will benefit. When we look at the individual sectors, of course, there are sectors which would entirely, be negatively affected by these scenarios, especially some sectors that are competing the sectors that would be, boosted by GERD. But in aggregate, when I say industry, then I talk about many sectors that falls into industry, and the same applies to services. Industry would benefit more than services because the industry generally is very close to agriculture, with a lot of agro industry that benefit from the raw materials coming from the agricultural sector. And there are a lot of complementarities between industry and agriculture, and therefore when the agricultural sector benefits, industry can easily benefit. But in all cases, the two sectors would benefit. And again, looking at the highest in positive impact, you would again see it under cropping pattern 2, which divides the land on crops based on their annual gross margin. This is the overall GDP, and the impact could reach under some combinations 82 billion through the whole period, of course. And again, you see it is cropping pattern number 2 which benefits the country more. Looking at welfare measured to what is called the equivalent variation for the individual households. And here we're not talking about individual household per se. I mean, not father and mother and kids. We're talking about groups of household. Our data includes 10 different groups of household. 5 of them are in rural areas and 5 of them are in urban areas. And each one, urban and rural, are divided based on their income. So we have high income households and low income households. So 5 of them. And this figure, just to make it simple for you, the borders outside the gray one and the borders inside the gray one, the other gray one, are not simulations. So the simulations fall between them, right? So if it is close to the smaller circle, then the impact is very small. When it is closer to the outside circle, then the impact is high. And these are our simulation, the 9 simulation. And you see the red one, collaboration combined with cropping pattern 2 would be the best scenario. And generally, you see that here we're looking at urban households, and here we're looking at rural households. You see that the circles are coming to the outside more for a rural household than urban household. So, and that is basically because of the income sources for these different households. And that I would explain a little bit maybe in the conclusion. So very important is that we focused here in this study on extension to agricultural land and expansion in generation of hydropower. These are induced by GERD. So these are some of the benefits from GERD. There are other benefits, but there are also other risks which we are not considering here. The impact, as we have seen in the figures, the overall GDP benefit through the period for 40 years could be between 47 and 83. And these, of course, would be different, and they could become negative if the other dimension and maybe risks are considered. The gains result, of course, from the additional crops that are produced in the country and the additional generation of electricity. The agriculture GDP would benefit by up to 24 billion through the whole period as compared to a baseline without GERD. And the industry and services would also benefit equally, with industry benefiting more than services. Coming to household, you see that the benefits to rural household are higher than the benefits to urban household. And that is driven by the ownership of production factors. As you know that urban households would be affected by what would benefit from hydropower, because it is mainly about the urban, the urban area generally consume more electricity than rural areas, while the rural household would benefit from more employment opportunities to work in this newly grown or cultivated land. And therefore, you see this mixture of benefits to rural and urban household. Very important is the choice of cropping pattern, and that is a point which I would like to highlight. Despite, regardless of what is happening now on the negotiation table or whatever, I think the administration of our agriculture in Sudan need to think about what kind of benefits that they might gain if not to benefit a lot, just to counter the risks that might come from GERD, to think about what kind of crops to be grown, what kind of cropping patterns, and what areas to be cultivated in the meantime. Caveats that I would like to highlight is that we did not include everything, as I highlighted at the beginning. So we did not talk about the investment costs. I mean, the new extensions in agriculture and hydro generation needs new investments, needs money to be injected in them. We did not include that here. We did look at some of the positive benefits. We did not look at the environmental damage or the negative impacts. Not all the negative impacts and not all the positive impacts are included here. And in accounting for them would certainly produce another kind of results. So probably I would stop here, and maybe during the discussion session, I'll be happy to elaborate more on one or more of these dimensions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. These presentations are very complementary to each other. You know, Frederick covered as a journalist, bad news versus solution-based stories. And Dr. Khalid started with the two questions about benefits and risks. And it reminded me of a quote from the famous poet Khalil Gibran: "The optimist sees the rose and not its thorns. The pessimist stares at the thorns, obvious to the rose." And I think we need optimism. We need, positive approach to overcome the gridlock. Our next speaker, we gave him two tasks today. He has his own presentation, and I also asked him to summarize the main theme and that lead us to the Q&A to summarize at the end. Dr. Asafa is one of the We Aspire expert members. He had written over a dozen articles for We Aspire. Dr. Asafa is a system decision support group lead at the Tampa Bay Water, the largest wholesale water provider in Southeast United States. His group is responsible for technical analysis and modeling of projects ranging between 200 million to 400 million. Dr. Asafa is affiliated with the University of South Florida, USA, and provides short courses and training at Pan-African University in Energy and Water, Timican, Algeria. Dr. Trusso has written more than 35 peer-reviewed articles in various areas of water resource management. He's a registered professional engineer with the state of Florida, a diplomat of the American Academy of Water Resource Engineers, and fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He's currently chairs Florida Water Climate Alliance. Dr. Trusso, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen in the mode? Yeah. You can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you everyone for joining us today. When we were planning to have this webinar and having expert, as you just heard, from systems engineer, hydrologic expert with Paul, and then the media, acclaimed climate journalist Frederick, as well as economist Khalid. So I was thinking, how can I blend all these three things that we raised today? So you will see a little bit of building up what they said in terms of a little bit of hydrology, a little bit of this perception in terms of media that Frederick mentioned, and then also some of the economic aspect of GERD and how we should take advantage of that. Given people are very well aware where we are today, I just want to also highlight, what's the bottom line kind of thing. So you will see in my presentation all those things mixed up in a way. So what's holding the GERD and the negotiation and how we could potentially move forward. As you know, this is going back to the so-called Washington Agreement. There are a lot of things embedded on these things that they didn't agree. It includes the filling, how should be filling, and then also operations. Paul touched in terms of the long-term operations and how that actually related to some of the decision, and that's the big one. And then also drought management. So with drought management means droughts, they are going to occur. We are not in a drought today, but at some point in the future, they will come. So how do you deal with those? And then climate change, future water use. Frederick mentioned about some of the less coverage given for climate change. You know, the demand is going to grow in the future. So how do you deal with that? And the climate is going to change. We know for sure it's going to change. It's just we are arguing probably how much precipitation will change from today, 20 years, 30 years from now. For sure, almost 90% of the models, they say temperature would go up. So how do you deal on those? There was also data sharing. I think Khalid also mentioned in terms of this predictability of release from the GERD is very important for Sudan. And I must mention that the closest dam they have is about 1/10 of GERD. So you would need this kind of data sharing and having some predictability. Paul also touched that in terms of how they could operate and how they can plan as well. And then there is these big things about binding agreement. What does it mean? So basically, hey, are you going to agree with some specific release from now to forever? Some of them, it works for initial filling. Some of them has consequences in terms of implications to water sharing. In fact, the last time we we have a conference, a webinar, and I posed a lot of questions to my panelists as well. The bottom line and the elephant in the room, the three countries are not addressing is water sharing. You can see that water sharing, whether it is through drought, whether it is through extended drought, release, historical right, all these as it stands today, and if one wants them to be a binding agreement, it really implicates a given share allocation, which they are not willing to address. So that's basically the problem. Drought will come, as I said. So when drought comes, how you fill that reservoir. So if everybody has its own share, you could use your share, let whatever you don't want. So that itself, the priority of how the dam GERD and between Aswan High Dam. So it boils down back to water sharing. Another issue is that GERD, while it is a single project on a single river basin, there is some implication on some of the issue they have, which directly points to a water sharing again. So to me, is the elephant in the room is the water sharing issue. So without addressing the implied water sharing, the option you would have will be, hey, how can we fill? A little bit you heard from Paul as well in terms of the first filling, and then how do you address those in some equitable, reasonable manner without impacting both downstreams and upstream countries. Most of you may have heard and about Colorado River. I'm not going to talk a lot, but I want to bring a specific things what's going on today. These days, I follow closely with what's going on with Colorado River. There is some lesson to learn. So big picture Colorado Basin, they have allocation between upstream and downstream users. You can see in the lower basin. So they have 7.5 million acres for downstream, and then the other 7.5 as well. And the way they have big two reservoirs actually. That's one in Lake Powell, and the other one is Lake Mead. Lake Mead is actually tied to some of the water sharing and drought sharing mechanism. So this is important. This is what I want to bring people's attention. There is so many things with Colorado River Basin. You could spend your years studying them, but specifically what I want to bring your attention is what exactly they did in terms of water sharing and drought sharing. So they have been working for long years to getting into a process of, they know how to share the water, but they need to know how to share the drought. And that's the sticky point with what's going on today. Who is responsible for the future drought? So what they came up here 2019 is actually came up with what they call the drought contingency plan that specifically ties different reservoir level to how they could share the drought through a reduction of a prior allocated values. So this is important. So what they did was that using Lake Mead, the second reservoir I showed you, at different level, they would actually trigger different cuts from these states. You can see Arizona will see some reduction, Nevada will see some reduction, Mexico will see some reduction as well. So they know how to share the water, and then they know how to share the drought. Why I'm bringing this today, you probably heard, is they are actually about to execute this plan that they agreed in 2019. So if you look at the current Lake Mead, it sits at 1084.3 feet. So it's projected by the summer, you'll see some of the news that they are about to execute these drought sharing mechanisms. So depending on how fast they could get there, I don't know, it is early summer or late summer, but they're about to execute this drought sharing mechanism. So I thought this is a very, very good example for Nile Basin as a whole as well. You share the water, you share the drought as well. Now, if I step back and go to the current situation with GERD, the big picture, we don't even agree how we define drought. And this goes back to what Frederick mentioning, and how you frame, how you communicate with people. Sometimes there is a twist, even the science. So it's up to us. Some of us, have to communicate how the science is. Some of them really doesn't make sense hydrologically. Some of the definition. If I have to pick, you can see that, in fact, the way drought defined in Egypt is anything less than the median. I have never seen this kind of drought definition in any textbook or any peer-reviewed article. Now, that's the issue. So when you define, how do you define even a drought? Then you will hear the media and some of the issues that they are not getting, how it really portray what GERD is doing. There are some impacts, as Khalid said, but it looks to me there is quite a bit of disconnect between the public, what the public is getting, and the reality from the science. Last year, it took me by attention. I mean, I was so shocked that, Ethiopia didn't even start feeling the GERD. And there is this AP picture showing, hey, there are some farmers. It's a true story. And then, the last several years, their land was dry. They couldn't. Now, the issue is, it is true, these guys, their land went dry. And I actually dig a little bit, what is behind this picture? And true to what Frederick mentioned, in fact, there is an article addressing all this in InfoNile. Go and you can read it, which I was impressed on how they actually spend a lot of time addressing some of them. So if you really look at the media and see that it looks like, oh, everything is going to be a problem, but the real issue was on this specific case was an internal water allocation in Egypt itself, primarily related to the 5 or more billion cubic meter that was allocated through Toshka. And that's the study, for example. So sometimes you do need how you frame issues, and whether you decide to scare the public, we don't go anywhere. In that case, we will not have any solution, or we need to define that. Now, recently, I am a hydrologist. My expertise is on that. Now, I hear also, hey, Ethiopia has a lot of rain and doesn't need its surface water. As you know, the Nile Basin constitutes about 69% of the surface water for Ethiopia. And if anyone, I'm not good detail on here, so Hydrology 101 tells us there is so many process how you, rainfall convert into stream flow. So it's not like you can use rainfall and do things. It just doesn't work. I want you to focus on evapotranspiration. There is others, rain falls, some of them gets into the deep aquifer, some of them gets in and then goes through Sudan, or there is a mass balance that hydrologists typically do following, like they say, follow the money. So follow the rain and how some of these would result into water. So this argument that, you have a lot of rain and you shouldn't use any of your water for consumptive use, that is simply not true, because the variability that Paul mentioned, in 3-4 months you get 80-90% of the rainfall which comes through the rain. How do you use that? You have to store it and you have to use that. If you are going to do all this little hydropower and irrigation in every little backyard, it's not going to work. So you have to account for that. So some of these are really not scientific, and it doesn't help in terms of communication. One thing we have done here is through what we call integrated hydrologic modeling. So basically what we did is we're going to look at the entire balance of the hydrology and follow the money, follow the rain. One thing we found, and this holds in many places, not just here in Florida, but we have tested this, it works, is that the amount of water as a percentage that gets evaporated is actually linearly higher and higher the less rain you get. And I want to bring your attention here. The less rain you get in this case is about 90% of the water just goes through evapotranspiration. That is the science. And some of them, it may get through the water, through the ground, through the aquifer, and then what comes out as a flow or river flow is only a fraction of that. This is important because sometimes, the argument is, hey, you got a lot of rain, you don't need, which is way, way far from the science, and goes back to how the media portray this as well. Now we are talking about the virtual water as well, which is not helpful as well. So some people argue, hey, you have a lot of cattle, there is virtual. All this doesn't help us. But if we want to look at the, very interesting in terms of water use, one thing I found specifically, and I have to call out in Egypt and how they portray like this is life and days for what's going on with GERD, it's just not true. And in fact, if you see, there is a great article by Dr. Elnor here as well, how GERD has been used as a mechanism to say for all the problem that Egypt has is because of GERD, but that's not true. If you go to the tourism, Egypt tourism, I took the second picture from their website. In fact, they are trying to expand this. Nothing wrong, they can do whatever they want, but I want to mention this. They, on the surface, this is also again how media plays without any scientific background. Some of them, for example, it shows, hey, Egypt has cut rice production. Okay, that looks good to me, but that rice production goes to Gulf. And the expert, they tell us, golf course actually take twice water than a rice field. Now, it's okay, they can use whatever water they need, but this is what you see how it is portrayed by the media on one sector, and this is how you see when they talk about GERD. Basically, it's going to dry up the whole country, which is not true. So it doesn't help us. I think if we have, this goes back to water allocation. So if we have a water allocation in every country, so it's up to them how they would use their share for whatever they want. But at the same time, you shouldn't use a single project as the enemy of all. I think that's the point. Paul talked about currently where we are in terms of as far as hydrologic and as far as any impact for the summer filling, we don't see anything. And in fact, that's, you can see the where Lake Nasser is now. You can see it's the highest it has been in 20 years. And you can, if you have to go 20 years, more than 20 years to get to where it is now. So there is plenty of water. He also shows some of the forecast in the season. We expect, more than average. So it is up to these countries to actually just not politicizing, forget about some of these other things. It's easy for me to say as a scientist, but there is a way forward in terms of cooperation. So how do you move forward in terms of cooperation. Drought storage for increased GERD for Egypt is clear. There are a lot of studies. I can talk for a day how climate change could be counterbalanced through some storage at higher, cooler space in Ethiopia. You have your regional economy that you can build in Egypt. Sudan, we just heard with Khalid that some of the increased power production, flood protection, yeah, he mentioned about those as well, not directly in terms of monetary, but he talked about in terms of the production and also electricity. We actually have one of my partner here, Dr. Alam. He actually finished his preliminary result of the 2020 flood. And if GERD was in operation today, even at its normal operation before the dry season, which is 1/3 or 49 or 625 meters, it could completely avoid the devastation of what happened last year. So basically, even without doing anything special, the GERD would have accommodated the last year drought. Remember, last year drought is once in 100 years. It's not a simple, last year flood. For Ethiopia, obviously, to lift 65 million people currently in darkness, major economic boost. There is all kinds of things we heard. There could be a good opportunity. You sell power here, maybe buy. Sudan has a lot of agriculture. You can buy product from there. Sometimes, when I travel in Ethiopia and I see a juice or something imported from Middle East, I would think, wow, this should be cheaper to get it from Sudan. So if these people think in that sense, along the lines of what Khalid also mentioned, it's easier for them. It's just a transportation cost. It will be easier for me in Florida to get something is produced in Georgia rather than California. It costs a lot. Just simple economic there. There is enough water today. I think I would argue, in fact, even that 84 or so billion cubic meter, which is on the 2059 Nile agreement, there is just the stream flow is probably more than 90. And if we go through rigorous mass balance and so on, there is probably more than 100 BCM there. So we still don't know that. That's another topic we can talk for a long time. But there is enough water today and probably for the next 10 or so years. But there will come a time, 20 years, 50 years from now, that the water may not be enough unless we do something about both at the supply side and management side. This is the things we work here. You should not just only look at supply side. What can you do on a demand side? How can you improve your efficiency? How can you use best management or best practice for that limited water? So I personally think this is, while we are okay, next time it could be, and we have to work on that. In terms of reaching an agreement where they are, it should be easy. Of course, it's easy for me to say, but in terms of the feeling where we are, I just showed you where the historic stored water that is in Aswan. High favorable condition. So to me, it's in the best interest of both Sudan and Egypt to hold this water and then come back something, build confidence, pass through that, and then work on water and drought sharing mechanism. I will highlight drought sharing mechanism. So as you share water for everyone, you should share the drought as well. It's not something that being done. Takaza River is a good example what happened between Sudan and Ethiopia. In fact, without even any formal agreement, there was a lot of anxiety with Sudan, and you can ask probably Khalid, if you want, he can add on this, that there isn't any impact that I heard after this plant is online. So they got regulated flow, they increased their agricultural production. So that could be an example as well. So if we just remove some of the noise that has nothing to do with from science, I think there is. Sudan, in the past we heard GERD is our own Aswan High Dam for many reasons. We need them to be there as well. Sudan is a master of middle, so should take this opportunity to be a leader, in fact, within cooperations. They are literally in the middle of Egypt and in Ethiopia. So I think this is not something, it is complex, it's not easy, but it's not that we don't have any solution. If there is a will, there is always a way. What needs to be for both Egypt and Ethiopia is to focus the big picture, and what would help them is how can we come to the win-win solution. Most of us know it, some of them know it, but I think looks to me there are some noise there trying to just confuse the public in terms of scarcity, in terms of drought, is going to die, that kind of thing. I think we just have to just follow the science. With that, I would stop.
Thank you, Dr. Turso. And I appreciate all the speakers. We received some questions through chats, and I have one question for each of you. So I'll start with Dr. Block. It appears to me that Ethiopia was dealt a shorthand in terms of the water release. Even your study seems to suggest that there is another way of dealing in terms of how release scenarios should be handled. How do you think that these countries should take their time to figure out, to get a fair sharing, what exactly they need to do in such situation? If you are to advise the three countries, what would be your advice? Thank you.
Well, that's a big question for sure, right? And I imagine, I'll just say this from the beginning, if I had the exact right solution to that, I might not be sitting here. I might be sitting in some negotiations. I have not been in the negotiations. So I will offer some thoughts, but clearly the answer to this goes beyond engineering and science, right? Economics is huge, as Khalid was discussing in his presentation. There are lots and lots of aspects that go into this. We talk about the hydropolitics of the Nile. And if you break that up, you get hydro and politics, right? I think from some of the presentations today, we've seen that there are lots of benefits on the hydro side. In my opinion, it's the hurdles probably remain more on the political side. But that's just a personal opinion. So when we talk about water sharing, the challenge there, of course, is it becomes immediately contentious just from talking about, just from the mention of that, right? And it already feels like a divisive framing, because now we're talking about who's getting and who's gaining and who's losing. Frederick brought up a very good point. I think we need to continue to focus on the aspects of it not always necessarily just being about water, but it's really about benefits, right? And so how can we move the discussion in a way, particularly perhaps in the public, where we're not talking about Egypt losing out on water and Ethiopia gaining water, just to be blunt, but how there can be benefits to all countries by better sharing this. And Tirsu brought up this by even talking about, storage in Ethiopia reduces evaporation, which can have downstream benefits just in terms of more available volume, et cetera. So I'm not going to claim to have the answer to this, but it's really, really important. I also want to, the discussion of let's say, allocations, water sharing policies. Two other points, and then I'll invite the other panelists to comment. One is, I'm working with some colleagues at Bardar University who have been doing in Ethiopia, and they have been conducting some surveys among experts. Maybe some of you received those about water sharing policies or factors, I guess, based on the United Nations framing. And then taking the responses to these have been experts in the Nile Basin countries, but globally as well. And then trying to take those and put those into a modeling framework to understand what that may look like and how would those allocations actually change. It's a point for discussion. It's not to pinpoint the amount. Second point to mention is the GERD, of course, and I believe one of the earlier speakers mentioned this, is one project, right? Hugely important project, but one project on one river in the Nile Basin. There will be other projects that will be developed either on the Nile or on tributaries to the Nile. This one is important because it's really setting a precedent, but locking something in based on GERD operations, I believe from the Ethiopians' perspective is short-sighted in that they're also focused on future and further development. So that's an important part of the conversation as well. I'll pass it off and maybe come back around again if others would like to contribute to that question. It's a good question. It's a challenging one.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll give others to reflect once we address questions from the floor. My next question goes to Frederick. There's a lot of misinformation regarding GERD and what it can do for the Nile basins. Some of this includes how it is expressed in the news. You typically see a massive dam or the largest dam in Africa, which is not true in terms of storage and then drought in Egypt. What do you think that journalists have to do to make sure that they don't propagate certain stereotypes? You're on mute, Frederick.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much. It's actually part of what I said in my presentation. Now, it is very important for the journalists to be armed with facts. And they can get these facts from scientists. So it is very important for journalists to work with the scientists who are not biased, to give them info that they can, feed to the audience. You would wonder, when journalists write, where do they get this information? What is it true information? Some journalists may know this as they have information, it is true, but they cannot be sources on their own. They have to get credible information from scientists. So my first thing is that scientists and journalists have to work together. You have seen amazing work that has been presented here by scientists and researchers, and not so much is known by reporters. If all this is given to journalists and the journalists go ahead and publish it, I mean, this can be the beginning point to make sure that that false information out there, it does not spread anymore. And then give people the right information, and then they take the right decisions instead of taking decisions based on wrong information. Yes, I think that's the point I wanted to bring out. But also, I think I will use this question if asked me to also answer a question from one of the persons attending. That was the first question I think we got. And he's asking about solutions-based stories, and the alarming stories, especially like what you have said. So now this answer goes to the two questions. I strongly believe that we have to make solutions journalism a priority. So when we do give solutions journalism a priority, it will help counteract false information, because now there are facts already there. And again, to answer that question, when we give solutions journalism a priority, then we help to set agenda for the audience in the Nile Basin. So then we bring these issues in the limelight. The right issues that we get from scientists, we bring them to the limelight, and then we help to show people the right information, to tell the difference between the wrong and the right. Yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. My next question goes to Dr. Siddiq. Thanks for the great study that shows the GERD benefits for Sudan. Your analysis does not seem to look at the economic impact of flood, including what happened last year. It's known that more than 100 people died and more than hundreds of million property damage. How does your study change if one has to account such kind of analysis?
All right, thank you, Thompson, for posting this, and my appreciation also goes to the person who asked the question, and this is a very good question. Yeah, I think the first thing that we decided to do in our study is to be very transparent in what we covered and what we did not cover. And the one who asked the question was rightly, posting this, saying that we did not include the flood. And I highlighted, I also saw a question on flood control when I highlighted it as one of the potential benefits. And directly saying that, well, flood control, and then what happened last year? Well, yes, that was not included, and that is important, and I believe that would be a very good benefit from GERD to get control on that. I'm not actually the right person to talk about the technical control. I mean, the control on flood from a technical point of view. I think Paul could say a few words about that. But according to my my knowledge, which I gained from my collaborators who are hydrologists, GERD can help on that. Now, coming to your question, or to the question, if we include that, one can do that also with side calculations. You just look at how much has been lost in terms of assets and resources. I don't know how one can calculate people who died actually, and come up with and reduce the benefits. And the benefits cannot only be reduced by the damage that has happened from the flood control, but we cannot say that what has happened last year was due to GERD, because I assume if GERD was not there, Paul can also comment on this. I assume that if GERD was not initiated at all, probably flood would have also happened. I'm not sure about that, but I think if GERD would be there in place, and the control on the flow of water would be there, information would be shared, I believe that such kind of catastrophes would not happen. That was a pity, it was a disaster, but I cannot simply say that it was because of GERD. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siddiq. My next question goes to Dr. Taruso. We have seen studies that say there is quite a bit of inefficiencies in water use in Egypt. When one talks about drought management, in fact, some studies indicates that Egypt could save as much as 40 billion cubic meter from the water management options. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, this is, it's not only Egypt. I think water management, that's what my expertise is from urban water supply specifically. You look at both supply and demand management options. So I think the questionnaire who's referring is based on some studies from Egyptians that they look at different scenarios. I don't remember exactly, from how much from this sector, but they come up with this aggregate number. It could be 40 billion. But I can tell you from my expertise, because I'm urban water expert delivery. So simply, many places you have these inefficiencies, and I think the last studies we have from, I probably referenced that too, from 2019, finished water delivery. That's what I do. In Egypt was, I think, from 2019, it's about 11.2 or so billion cubic meters. I'm talking about finished water. And then you have maybe more than 1 billion coming from the groundwater, and then another 10 billion or so coming from the Nile itself. Their own report shows that more than 3 billion was lost. It's not me, it's what they said. So that I can tell you, but how they get to 40 billion in terms of this calculation, the irrigation benefit or efficiency, I can't talk. I have no way to doubt them. It's their own study, but I can tell you from at least finished water that I know there is that much, at least 3 billion. But it's not only for Egypt. Of course, obviously they are the biggest user of the water. As you go forward, because of climate change, because of increased population, you have to do a way how you manage your limited resources. And this is both from supply and demand side. So I think I want to make people understood that it's not just only a demand problem, or it's not only the supply problem. It is both demand and supply problem we have.
Thank you, Dr. Toure. So for the next question, I invited one of our We Aspire expert, a PhD candidate, Magdalawi, to answer. And the question is, why Ethiopia did not share the technical studies and designs of the GERD with Sudan, and to make it feel safe. Magdalawi?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
The question, I guess the answer to that question is that Ethiopia actually did share documents. So back when the International Panel of Experts was organized with professionals from all the 3 countries, and also international professionals, Ethiopia actually shared more than 150 documents, technical documents, to the IPOE, to the International Panel of Experts, in order exactly for the reason that the person who asked the question raised, to ease the tension, to ease the concerns of these 2 downstream countries. And as far as concerns of Sudan go, dam safety, that was the biggest issue raised. And it was actually an open and closed case with the dam safety issue back in 2015. Dam safety was raised as one of the major issues. There were studies done, and then the dam was declared safe. And all the recommendations that the IPOE, the International Panel of Experts, gave to Ethiopia were taken to the dot without any amendments. So in the sense of alleviating the concerns of these downstream countries, especially Sudan, with respect to dam safety, Ethiopia was actually very transparent. It shared all the technical documents, I mean, more than 150 documents, and the concerns of dam safety were alleviated. Or it was a case closed already. And the only reason that we're hearing about it now is because of political reasons, and not because there's a new issue with the dam safety. So the short answer to that is that's actually not true. Ethiopia did actually share documents and made actually all possible efforts to alleviate the concerns. Yeah.
So thank you, Magdalawi. This is a critical questions. That's why I felt to bring an expert who's working on the matter to address that question. If any of the panelists wants to add on this, if not, I have quite a few questions for you. The next one is for Dr. Siddiq. I send you via chat the question, but I will read it. Thanks. First of all, I appreciate We Aspire for organizing the meeting. I appreciate of the wise choice of the panelists. Questions for Dr. Siddiq. In the collaborative scenario you mentioned about guaranteed release by Ethiopia irrigation water demand level to Sudan, by this, what does the level of irrigation Dr. Siddiq has in mind, present level, future etc? How much in BCM does he think Sudan will be satisfied if this guarantee is granted? Thanks again. It's a lot of question in one question, Dr. Siddiq, and you have it on your chat if you want to look at it. If you want to chew on it, I can go to another question and I'll come back to you. Is that fair? You need to unmute.
Yeah, so that's okay. Thank you very much. And I also appreciate the question from the person who asked. Well, I would do my best to answer what I know, and what I don't know, I would not spend time, finding a way for it. The thing is, when the cooperation, the 3 states of cooperation, we took from another study done by Bashir and others. And there they quantify the requirement of the Sudan. I think that was depending on what has been happening already, the amount of water that is needed, and then from there they calculated it, feeding the information in the crop model and the river system models. And what we did in the economic part, so the economic analysis we did, we took the outcome of the other models that takes the water volumes and the hydrological indicators into our economic model. In our economic model, we don't have water volumes. We have only money. And we have the water sector as a monetary sector represented in our model. and we introduced the changes from the biophysical models into the economic model. So if the person asked is really interested in how the volume of water is quantified, then I would suggest looking at the article. I would share the title of the article soon in the chat, and then maybe you can refer to that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, any one of your panelists can pick this up. It's referring to a report. It doesn't mention the specific report name. It says that according to the Ethiopian reports that the Ethiopian livestock consume 90 billion meters square more than the annual production of the Blue Nile. I don't know what report is referring to, but if anyone has any idea of what the person is asking, if not, Dr. Truso.
Yeah, I think this is, we have seen in the news, and I try to mention a little bit, this is what they are talking about is virtual weather. In fact, the idea of virtual weather is not new. People study and worldwide and how the water consumption, if you see some of the studies in research in virtual weather, they actually track who imports how much and so on, and it shows everything. Basically, the Europe is consuming a lot of the water of the world through virtual weather calculation. I think that's some of the work of virtual weather idea is that how can we have sustainable environment as a whole, as a globe, and so on. But this is not related. So I think they are mixing things that are not even applicable, in my opinion. That what they're saying is that, hey, the livestock will take so much water. I explained about the evapotranspiration. Whether it is eaten by a cow or not, that water will evapotranspire. The cow eat the grass. So where they are going is, okay, there is water that evapotranspires through the agriculture, and then the cow is eating. So this idea that Ethiopia has more cows, a lot of cows, and I saw a picture, whether those cows actually looks like you have a lot of water on them, it doesn't make sense to me. So this idea is just a little bit of misinformation, goes back to how the media framing and just arguing on Ethiopia has more cows, and since by the way of that they take more grass, which otherwise will evaporate anyway, make no scientific sense to me in terms of mass balance of the water in the Nile.
Anyone in the panel want to reflect on this more? Okay, we're doing excellent in terms of time. Dr. Truso, would you like to do an overall summary, and I will close the meeting?
Yeah, I really want to appreciate all the panelists that they took their Saturday morning. It's not easy, and coordinations, and some of things we have to really communicate with them in a short notice and that kind of things. Really, we learn a lot from the systems-based as hydrologic and big picture. I don't want people to forget what Paul says. Hopefully, some of them will hear that. That is a very important point that was raised there. Some of them we don't have an answer today, but I think it will spark some interesting discussion in terms of where we want to go as a regional, how there are some ideas from his paper as well in terms of weather sharing. It could be a framework. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but I think that provide great information about people to follow up. I also appreciate what Frederick raised, that this is what we want to make sure that the media doesn't twist or in one way or another. It's very important because the media we have here, we call boundary organizations. So I work for boundary organization, means how do you translate research from university to actionable community? So that boundary organization includes media people, or practitioners like me or others in social study as well, it is very important how we translate the academic information to actionable science, as we call it. So I appreciate really what Frederick brought, and hopefully people that take it serious, and some of the journalists that may heard from him. It's very important to dig the fact. It may take more time. Sometimes, people go for small click. That's the easiest way things they do. So I appreciate that. And Khalid, of course, I think brought us a very good idea, given some of the issues still with GERD, and it doesn't mean everything is green. Everything is a hunky-dory that we're going to celebrate. There are some issues that he raised in terms of related with Sudan, but there are also a lot of benefit. I think focusing on what each country gets rather than what they are going to lose is the big picture I'm going to take from this webinar. And I really appreciate all our panelists. They're taking their time and joining us today. That's all I have.
Thank you. We're known for starting on time, finishing on time. So unless anyone has anything to say, I'm going to bring the meeting to close. And I really appreciate all the panelists. And I also appreciate our member, Magdalawit, to jump on in a short notice to address a very critical questions that came from the attendees. In the past few webinars we have tried very hard to bring an expert from Egypt. We will continue trying. If they're listening, we're open. We Aspire is non-partisan, non-political. It's an African think tank. It's open for everyone, really. As Frederick said earlier, the narrative from the diplomats and the politician versus the fact, and that we have to strike a balance there. And we have to be very optimist, as Dr. Siddiq mentioned in his presentation. I really like how he started his presentation with questions, benefits versus risks. So thank you all. We look forward to seeing you again on another panel. Visit our website, weaspire.info. We have lots of information. Folks like Frederick, who's in the news business, feel free to use any of the materials that we have out there, so long as you give us proper credit. And we're also open to give you a platform to disseminate some of the balanced news that you're working on to work very hard. So thank you and happy Saturday for all of you. Thank you very much.